Okay, today we're going to talk about how to cross stitch. So we're going to start with a kit. Oftentimes you will start with a kit. Your kit is going to come with thread, of course, your fabric. It will come with a tapestry needle. It is important if you're buying needles, you get tapestry needles. They are not pokey, so they won't poke you, and they go through the fabric better. So you don't want to use a sewing needle that is really sharp. And then you will also have a pattern. This one also comes with a little mat to frame your finished project with. So we're going to set this over here so we can kind of see it. Your pattern is going to give you your general instructions. It's going to show you exactly what we're going to talk about today about how you want to pull through your needle in your fabric. The important thing is it's going to tell you how many pieces of thread to use at a time. So for this one and for most patterns, we're going to use 2-ply thread. So what that means is when we separate out our thread, it comes in 6-ply. So we are going to have to divide up our thread before we start stitching, but you only divide up the piece you're about to use. So let's find a piece of dark green. So the pattern is going to show you all of your colors. It's going to show you what it looks like on the pattern. And then it's kind of your job to figure out what's what. So we've got multiple greens. We've got light green, dark green, and you can kind of tell here the difference between the light green and the dark green. And we are going to be starting with dark green. So I'm going to pull the dark green out, and here's where you can see this is 6-ply. There's 6 pieces of thread here. We only need 2, so we are going to pull 2 pieces apart. Some people pull one apart and then bend it in half. I don't recommend that. It knots more often if you do it that way. If you're going to use one piece, cut it in half and then flip it so they twist the same way. But it's easiest to just pull 2 pieces apart. Okay, so once you have your 2-ply, I generally try to work with a piece of string that's about the length of my arm. This is a little bit longer, but it's not going to be a big problem. If you use too long of a piece, it'll knot more often while you're stitching. So we have our piece of thread ready to start with. When you look at the pattern, a lot of them will have a dot in the middle. This one does not. You want to start in the center of your pattern, and that's what these arrows are pointing to, is that's the center of each side. So we just follow these to the center, which is right here. And then you start stitching the closest place to that center. This line here is called backstitching, and you can see over here it tells you that's a dark green backstitch. That is done slightly different than the rest of your cross stitch. So we're going to skip that for now, and we're going to go up to this X, which is our actual cross stitch. So that's where we're going to start our pattern. Now with your thread, you can count all of the squares to find your center, but a pretty simple way to do it is just to fold your piece in half one way, and then in half the other way, and stick your needle in the center spot. They often give you much more fabric than you need. This is so that you can get your piece framed when you're finished, so you really don't have to worry about being exact. You're going to have plenty of fabric. So my center was right here, so I need to go up 1 square. So I'm just going to move my needle up 1 square here so I know exactly where I'm going to start. Now I'm going to thread my needle. Tapestry needles tend to have very large holes because you do tapestry also with thicker yarn, so it's usually not too challenging to get your thread in by just licking the end and sticking it through the needle. Now you're going to have your thread somewhat doubled over. Again, the shorter the thread you have going in and out of your fabric, the less knots you're going to get. But we're not actually stitching double. Okay, so we're going to start by taking our needle. You're going to come up from the bottom through your center hole, and that's going to be the bottom left of your first cross stitch. You want to leave a tail behind. We're going to stitch over that to lock our thread in place. You don't want to leave too short of a tail. If you leave too long of a tail, you can always cut it, but too short, it can pull out. And then up front, we're going to make our first cross stitch. So you're going to go from your bottom left of your square to the top right of your square and put your needle in. And then pull your thread through And then you're always going to then come back to your bottom right in the front. So from the back, you're going up one, and that's going to lock that thread in. So and when you pull it, you can tell it's locked in on the back. From the bottom right, we're going to go up to the top left, and that's going to make our full stitch. Now, when you're cross stitching, the traditional way to do it is if you have a whole line of stitches you have to do, you do all of your bottom left to top right stitches first and go across, and then come back with your bottom right to your top left. You can also do each stitch completely. There's a name for that, and I can't remember the name of it. But for this pattern, most of our stitches are single. We aren't doing a lot of long lines. So we're going to do mostly single stitches. So once we come up and finish that one, our next stitch on our pattern is directly above that stitch. So we are going to come up. Now, typically you start bottom left, go to top right, but because we just came in this hole, if we try to come back out this hole, the thread's going to come out. So we're going to kind of alternate, and we're going to go up to our top right and go down to the bottom left instead, and then come to our bottom right. And up to our top left. And you just saw me struggle a little bit because I had to move my fingers. I am not using an embroidery hoop today. This pattern is fairly small. The fabric starts off fairly stiff, which is what your embroidery hoop would do for you. If you're doing a larger pattern, you're going to want to use embroidery hoops because as you work with the fabric, it's going to get less and less stiff, and then your stitches can get too tight. But because this is a fairly quick stitch, we don't necessarily need to use a hoop. So we just finished these two. Now with this pattern, because it's a lot of words, right, we have a lot of single stitches, and then we're also going to jump a bit. So we are going to jump over. Here's the stitch we just finished. We're going to count 1, 2 to the third stitch over here to do the stitches for the A. Dragging your thread across the back isn't perfect. With some fabrics, especially very light fabrics, you'll be able to see the thread in the back when you mount it to frame it. This fabric is not super light, and our thread will likely not show that much, and we also have all that back stitching to cover it up with, so we are going to drag our thread across. If we cut our thread every 2 stitches, we're going to have a lot of threads sitting in the back anyway. That'll show through as well. So we're going to just keep stitching. So I'm going to count over 2 from the bottom of that top stitch. So 1, 2, and that's going to be the start of this stitch here. So we're going to go bottom left to top right, and then since we're going to be going down instead of up, I'm going to go to the top left, down to the bottom right, because that makes it so that doing that next stitch down, I'm only dragging the thread across here to my bottom left rather than down 2 stitches. You can do whatever you're comfortable with. Again, with the kits, they generally give you an ample amount of supplies, so you're usually not going to be too challenged with, you're not going to run out of thread, even if you drag it a little bit further. So now we have, you can see our 2 stitches here and here. Now, when you cross stitch, you are going to do all of your cross stitching, and then you're going to come back and do your back stitching. But today, to make things simple, I think that's enough for you to kind of see how the cross stitching works. The next stitch we would count over 1, 2, 3 to do the T. I guess we can do that, and then I'll show you back stitching just to make sure. So we're going to count over 3 from our bottom stitch here. I'm going to go 1, 2, 3. And then to start the T, it goes down 1 stitch as well. So we're going to count down 1 stitch. Now I'm going to do this as if we were doing a line, so you can kind of see that. So I'm going to turn my fabric sideways. If we turn our pattern sideways, you'll see this is a line of 5 X's. So we're going to do 1, and then come down to the bottom left of the next one for 2. Bottom left for 3, bottom left for 4, left for 5. So now I've got my 5 bottom left to top right stitches, and now I'm going to go back and do my bottom right to top left stitches. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So now you see that's a little bit simple and a little bit cleaner. We're not jumping catty corner at all while we're stitching to get that entire line done. So again, if you were doing this pattern, you would finish all of the X's, all of your cross stitches first. The X's here are your green X's. You can see the hearts up here would be red. This is called a quarter stitch when it shows this tiny little heart. What that means is you're only going to do your bottom left to top right, and then when you come down to the bottom right, you're only going to stitch right to the center to make, it's really a half a stitch, but we call it a quarter stitch. And it could be either a cross in the bottom, a cross in the top, any of the corners. These double lines here would be your pink thread. I don't know, triangle, I guess it's a triangle, it looks a little like a house. That would be your light green. The square would be your blue, and the circle would be your yellow. So you would do all of those cross stitches and those colors first, and then you come back and do your back stitching. But for a matter of time today, we are going to do our back stitching now. So you can see these little kind of bubbly lines here, and it tells you the bubbly lines are dark green, which is the color we have right now. With back stitching, oftentimes it'll tell you to use only 1 ply. But you can also use 2 ply if you want it a little more bold. Since these are our letters, I'm going to stick with 2 ply. And I'm going to start with the back stitching for the 2 crosses for the T. So you come to the point on your pattern. So here we're at the top of the T. We're going across the bottom of that square. And we're just doing straight lines. And then we're going to come across and do the other side of the T. Now with back stitching, it's not always perfect. It's not always going to finish perfectly. Just like with our X's, we sometimes have to drag our thread a bit. I'm going to drag my thread down to do the bottom portion of the A here. Actually, I lied. I'm going to drag my thread over and do the top portion and then come down and do the bottom portion so I can go right across to the E. So I'm going to count down 1, 2, no, I'm going to count over 1. We're going to do the top of the A. And again, you don't ever want to come back up the hole you went down, because if you do, you lose your stitch. So we have to do that stitch over and then come down to the bottom right to do our diagonal stitch here. Okay, so we just finished the stitches for the A here in greatest. We're going to come over and do the T. So I mentioned earlier that if you're doing a long line at once, you stitch half and half, once across, once back. So we're going to do that with the line for the T. So we're going to turn the fabric like this, and we're going to turn our pattern like this, and we're going to count over 1, 2, 3 from the bottom here, and then we're going to count down 1. So we're starting this whole line of 5 here. So I'm going to count properly, 1, 2, 3, and then go down 1. And we are going to do this row of 5 stitches. So bottom left to top right, once, twice, So that is the first stitch for our 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stitches for our T. So now we're going to come down to our bottom right, to top left, and finish this row of stitches. So if we turn everything back around now, we will see that we have our 2 stitches for the E, 2 stitches for the A, 5 stitches for the T. So if we were doing this pattern in completion today, we would do all of our cross stitches first, and then we would go back and do our back stitching. But for today's example, we're gonna go to our back stitching, and we're just gonna talk quickly through the cross stitching. Over on our pattern, we have all of our colors. So the hearts would be red. This is showing us that there is a quarter stitch in red as well. I'm not sure exactly where on the pattern that is, but what a quarter stitch is you're going to do a whole half stitch basically. So I'm going to do it, this one is an example of the bottom right. So we are going to, you would do your first stitch and then you would come down to the bottom right as if you were going to finish your stitch. But instead of going all the way to the top left corner, you'd go to the center of the square. The thread doesn't always want to go in. So there you see, this is called a quarter stitch. To me, it's a half stitch, but it's a quarter stitch. It could be that they don't want that second line when they call it a quarter stitch. It doesn't give you that in the directions, but most of the time you're going to be outlining it anyway, so I always put the line in. Now, if you do a stitch you don't want, it's called frogging. So we are going to pull this stitch back out because we don't need this stitch. And we're going to move on to back stitching. So you can see in the pattern the back stitches are basically like the lines, right? And it is, a lot of people dislike back stitching, but it really does add to your stitching by making it much more detailed. I just got a knot. If you get a knot like this in your thread, it's generally really easy to get it out. You just put your needle through and pull, and then when you pull your needle out, the knot will pull right out. Okay, so we are going to do these back stitching lines. You can see these little kind of bubble lines. It tells us over here our dark green back stitch, which is the thread we're using right now. So we're going to start with the crossing of the T. So we're going to come to the bottom left corner here to the bottom right corner of the square. I'm actually going to start on the bottom right. Go to the bottom left, and we just make a line. And then we're going to come across the T and do it on the other side. And that's our T. So we're going to come over to our A with back stitching. It's not always going to be perfect, so you kind of have to gauge the best route to take. So I'm going to do the top here and come down to the bottom so I can go across to the E. So I'm going to come across one and make that top of the A, and then come down and do the diagonal. And again, you don't want to come back up the hole you just went down, because if you do, your stitch comes out. So if that ever happens, you put your stitch back in and you make sure you come out a different hole. And then I'm going to come back over and do this. Now, the question always gets asked, do you do every single square or do you do one long one? I think the general consensus for most people is you can do 2 or 3 at a time. More than that, it's not gonna sit nicely. So since this is 4, I'm going to break it up into 2 sets of 2. So I'm going to come up the top there, go down 1, 2, and then I'm going to come down 2 again and go back up. Now, you could have done that in 4, but I think the general consensus is 2 is going to lay pretty flat and make a nice line just as well with a few less stitches. So we're going to come and do the little diagonal here, and then come over one and do the bottom of the A. And now you can see our A and our T. And then we'll just come straight over and finish up the E.
Doesn't sound like a real bird. It sounds like a Disney bird.
So So I'm hitting the end of my thread here, and I don't want those extra two pieces to get stitched in, so I'm just gonna move my needle up a little bit. So now we're gonna jump up and do the top of the E. And now you can see we have eat from greatest. So that gives you the basics of cross stitch and back stitching, which are really the basics of cross stitch. What you may also have in your pattern are French knots. This pattern does not have any French knots, but if you ever do, they're actually quite simple. We'll just put one right above the E here. You will sometimes be told to do French knots with all 6 threads. We'll just do it with the 2 since we have it here. You just pull your thread through where you need the knot. You wrap it around your needle. You put your needle right back in the hole that you started with. Hold it fairly tight. Pull the thread through, and there you have a French knot. So you can see if we had 6 count thread, it would be a much bigger French knot than this. So it just depends what you're doing. But that's the basics of cross stitch: is cross stitching, back stitching, French knots. So I hope you enjoy stitching. If you do end up with any questions or if you need any supplies, this is Denise from Gathering Volumes Bookstore in Perrysburg, Ohio. So if you're in the Toledo area, feel free to stop in, show me your projects. I love to see everyone's work. Or if you have any questions or need any supplies, you can get them at the store.